Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Behind the Card. And tonight we're going to be featuring Danny White. I just played a game earlier today on Napa Football between the Dallas Cowboys and the Washington Redskins, and Dallas crushed Washington 38-3. And I wanted to talk about Danny White because this man had a tough act to follow in Dallas, following Roger Staubach, an iconic, legendary Hall of Fame quarterback. And Danny White is not in the NFL Hall of Fame, but I think that Danny White had a very good career, and that's what I wanted to talk about here. So Danny was actually selected in the third round. No, excuse me, the Dallas Cowboys selected him in the third round of the 1974 NFL draft, but they were mainly interested in him as a punter, which he was. He was also a punter, as he is in the 1981 season. But White chose to sign with the World Football League's Memphis Southmen, and he did play quarterback for them. And then in 1976, he signed with Dallas after the World Football League had ended. And through 1979, it says here, this is on the Wikipedia page, that he was the Cowboys punter and the backup to Roger Staubach, which is all true. And after Staubach's retirement following the 1979-80 season, White became the Dallas Cowboys quarterback. And he continued to be the punter through the 1984 season and punted for the last time in his career in 1985. So Danny White led the Cowboys to 3 consecutive NFL championships. 1980, the 80 championship versus the Philadelphia Eagles, 81 versus the San Francisco 49ers, and 82 versus the Washington Redskins. They lost all 3 of those games. They were favored to win all 3 of those games, which were all on the road, and Danny White was the quarterback in all 3 of them. And they never won those games. And after that, they never got back to a championship game again. And I think that is one of the many reasons why Danny White is not held in the same kind of regard as Troy Aikman and Roger Staubach, because obviously they had been to the Super Bowl, they won championships. And Danny White, although he had a very good career, for whatever reason, was not able to get the Cowboys to the Super Bowl. But you can't blame that all on one player. And you can't blame that all on Danny White. And it says here, in a memorable 1980 playoff game against the Falcons, he did lead the Cowboys to a come-from-behind 30-27 victory. And so I think if White had a game, or if he had led the Cowboys to a Super Bowl and they had won, he's held in much higher regard, and people have a lot more of a favorable opinion. Not that they don't have a favorable opinion, but he's just not as remembered as much as an Aikman or Staubach, obviously, who are icons, or even a Tony Romo. And if you think about it, Romo and his career is pretty similar to Danny White, because they had very good, if not great, seasons in the regular season, and then for whatever reason could not get the team to the Super Bowl. I mean, if you can say anything about Danny White, though, hey, at least he got the Cowboys to the championship game, which is something that the Dallas Cowboys in the last 20, 25 years haven't been able to do. So he was able to do that. So yeah, he led them to 3 consecutive championship games. And after the loss to the Washington Redskins in the 82 championship game, he was actually knocked out of that game with a concussion, and he was replaced by Gary Hogeboom, who was only in his 3rd year. And they damn near made a comeback in that game, but Washington was better. And after that season, Dallas had a quarterback controversy. Do we go with Danny White, and do we stick with the veteran, or do we go with Gary Hogeboom? Now, I did not know this until a few years ago, but in the ESPN 30 for 30 from Elway to Marino, there was a trade that was explored, which would have sent John Elway from the Baltimore Colts to the Dallas Cowboys along with a plethora of draft picks. And Danny White would have been traded to Baltimore to be reunited with his coach from Arizona State, Frank Kush. That deal never happened, but I always thought that was fascinating. I get the impression, though, that Danny White would rather have stayed in Dallas than to go to Baltimore. I don't blame John Elway one bit for not wanting to play for that team. They put the fun in dysfunctional. And so Danny White stayed there, and he had his best year, actually, in 1983. But the next year, this is 1984, he lost his job to Gary Hogeboom. Cowboys started 4-1 that year, but then he ended up getting his job back. They finished at 9-7. And then in 85, they went to 10-6, and they lost to the Rams in the playoffs. Then we go to 86. They started 6-2. They had the number one offense in the NFL. And he was actually rated the number one rated passer in the NFC at one point. But in an away game against the New York Giants, a blindside sack by Giants linebacker Carl Banks broke White's throwing wrist and tore ligaments, knocking him out of the game and ending his season. They lost the game, and without him, the team finished 7-9 and had their first losing season since 1965. He did return as a starter at the beginning of 87, but then he was benched for Steve Pallor for 4 of the final 6 games. And then the next year, he was relegated to being a backup. And then he retired in July of 1989, and that paved the way for Troy Aikman to take over as quarterback. Incidentally, Troy Aikman met with Tom Landry before Landry was fired. And Landry had told him, he said, "We're going to pick you in the draft." Landry was fired. That's when Jerry Jones became the owner, and Jimmy Johnson came in, and the Cowboys drafted Aikman anyway. So regarding the legacy of Danny White, it says here, being Roger Staubach's successor and never reaching a Super Bowl as a starting quarterback contributed to White's being an unappreciated player, even considering all of the successes he achieved for the Cowboys and the NFL during the decade of the 80s. And Tom Landry said, "I don't think anybody could have followed Roger and done as well as Danny. Danny was a solid winner," and he was a solid winner. He just was not a Super Bowl winner, and he was not an NFC championship winner. But as I often tell people, Super Bowl championships are great, but does that mean just because you won a Super Bowl, does that mean that you're a better quarterback? I mean, no disrespect here, but Dan Marino does not have any Super Bowl championship, but Trent Dilfer does have a Super Bowl championship. Does that mean that Trent Dilfer is a better quarterback than Dan Marino? Trent Dilfer, I think, was a very good quarterback and he's a better commentator, I think, great broadcaster, knows the game inside and out. He was a very good quarterback, but Dan Marino, for me, this is just my humble opinion, Dan Marino is the best passer that I ever saw in my lifetime. So I think that Danny White had the onerous task of having to follow Roger Staubach. We've all heard that expression, "we'll follow that," that you're a tough act to follow. Well, I mean, talk about Roger Staubach. That's a very tough act to follow. But Dallas, they still had some very good teams. I mean, if you look at the records of the teams here that when he was starting, 1980, they were 12-4, 11-4 in 81. In the games he started, 6-3 in 82, 12-4 in 83. And then in 84, he was not starting that year. That's when Hogeboom had replaced him. He went 3-3. 85, 10-4, 86, 4-2, and then 87, he was 3-6. But overall record, 62 wins and 30 losses. That's not bad. That's a pretty good record there. 21,259 yards passing, 155 touchdowns, 132 interceptions. Okay, but an 81.7 rating. It's pretty good, and it's actually very good. So Dallas won today, and boy, did they win ever over Washington. And it's going to be exciting to see what happens with Danny White and the 81 Cowboys. A couple of months ago, I did a replay of the 81 NFC Championship game, and Dallas actually, he led them to a comeback. They were down 17-0 at the half, and they came back and had a 20-17 lead. And maybe it was 21-17. I think it was 20-17 down to the last 2 to 3 minutes of the game. And I'm thinking, oh my God, is Danny White going to lead the Cowboys to the Super Bowl here in this alternate NFC Championship? No, didn't happen. Joe Montana came back and led. It was a different catch this time, but they won at the last minute, and Dallas lost the game. So who knows what's going to happen in this 81 replay, but I just wanted to come on and give a little shout out here to Danny White and show some appreciation. And I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Hope everybody has had a wonderful weekend. Stay tuned for next weekend. I'll see you soon.